All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is May Vang, and I'm with the Minnesota DNR Fish and Wildlife Outreach Section. Welcome to the 237th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. And believe it or not, the fishing opener is right around the corner, so it's this weekend. And I'm sure many of you who are here today are very excited to get out there, and many of you already have a favorite fish that you're really looking forward to reeling in. So today's guest is the perfect guest. So we have Brian Nurbin, who is here with us today, and he's one of our DNR's fisheries manager, and he's actually here to talk with us today about the walleye outlook for this year, how walleye are managed, and then to give you some tips and tricks to catch your first walleye of the season. So with that, welcome, Brian, and thank you so much for being here. I know you have some really great information to share with us today, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you. If you can start off by sharing a little bit more about yourself and what you do here at the DNR. Thank you
Great.
for being here.
Thanks for that introduction, May. Yeah, my name is Brian Nurbin, and the Regional Fisheries Manager job entails basically I oversee 8 area fisheries offices in a geographic area from basically Mille Lacs in the center of the state all the way down to the Iowa border, sort of that sort of southeast quarter of the state. And so I get to oversee some of the fisheries management decisions that are made among those 8 area offices about where to stock fish, what are the fishing regulations, what sort of habitat work we want to do, other things like that. So I sort of am in the middle between those area offices that are doing that on the ground work and some of the statewide stuff that happens maybe around policy at a statewide level for fishing, which is a lot of fun to have all of those different options for things I get to work with. So today I'm going to get into a little bit about that management work to start, and talk a little bit about walleye biology, because it's really helpful to understand that stuff when you think about walleye fishing, because that really can help you to up your success if you understand some of those things. So yeah, here's the roadmap for today. We're going to talk a little bit about that management, some of the things that the DNR does to manage walleye, whether that's our stocking or our regulations or some of that habitat work we do, cover some of that walleye biology, and then we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of fishing as you get ready for the fishing opener. And I'm really excited to talk about that in this week. There's a lot going on as people get excited about what I think is really one of our state's big unofficial holidays, is the fishing opener. It's awesome to be in a state that has such a passion for fishing and so many opportunities that we've got here too. And I really love working in a state that has all of that as well. So let's talk a little bit about walleye and spawning, and then how that plays into our stocking. So in the springtime, walleye are doing their thing spawning, and DNR takes advantage of that as we want to basically get walleye eggs that we can then fertilize and then raise those fish to be able to stock into lakes other places. So that starts with us doing these egg takes at a specific location where we can actually have a good chance to capture a large number of walleye and take as many eggs as we want. So this is actually, that you can see in the photo, this stripping of the eggs from a female walleye and getting prepared to then fertilize those with a male walleye. And then those fertilized eggs we'll be able to use for our rearing purposes. So here's how we kind of do that. This is a spawning platform that we use. We set these up in certain places around the state where we know that there's a concentrated run of walleye that are going to travel through a choke point. Usually this is a river sort of a setting that's flowing into a lake that has a good population of walleye. Walleye like to spawn in one of 2 places, either in sort of a riverine setting that has gravel, that has a lot of flow of oxygenated water flowing across that gravel, and that's where they'll lay their eggs within a river, or they try to find the similar habitat in lakes. And so we're trying to then pick out a spot where we think a walleye is going to go to find one of those habitats. So a lot of times it's in these sort of river mouth areas, and we actually have something. And you can see on the screen, if you can see my pointer, there's something that blocks off a portion of the river. It's basically kind of a net. And then we've got what we call a trap, where the fish swim into kind of a funnel area, where they swim into this area where they can get held overnight. And then we come out each day and check how many fish have swum into the trap and do our thing with actually sorting out males from females and then doing that stripping that I showed in the first slide. So once we do that, and you can see in this map on the right, we've got 11 different, or sorry, 10 different cool water hatcheries where we maintain walleye eggs during this time of the year. And so those are either the circles or the squares on the map. Those stars are our cold water hatcheries where we raise trout, so not as important for this conversation. But you can see the jars in the photograph. Each of those jars probably holds about 150,000 walleye eggs. And you can see just by the number of jars that are in this picture, it literally adds up to millions and millions of walleye eggs that we take in the springtime and then raise to hatch and then eventually stock. So those walleye eggs will stay in the hatchery for, about 2 weeks, give or take. That depends on the water temperature a little bit. The colder the water, the slower that development happens. But after that couple weeks, they hatch, and these are what our juvenile walleye just hatched out of the egg look like. And you can see if you look closely, a couple small little black dots. And those are the two eyes of the fish, and then the rest of the body behind. When they first hatch out of the eggs, they actually have what's called a yolk sac that'll feed them for their first couple days of life. And so we can then move them from their hatchery that they were reared in, and then stock them either into a lake where that will be their new forever home, or sometimes we will stock those into a rearing pond where we can grow them through the summer so that they can do a bigger size, because certain lakes, we don't have as much success stocking these really small fry because there's things that eat them, other fish and other things. And so by stocking at a larger size, we can sometimes get past some of those bottlenecks. It's obviously a preferred method to stock these fry at this stage if they do well in those lakes that we stock, because we can stock a whole lot of them for a really cheap price. If we're going to rear fingerlings, which are shown in this picture here, we put them in a rearing pond, which are often natural ponds out on the landscape. They grow through the summer eating insects and other things in the pond. And then we harvest them out using nets, and they're 4 to 6 inches long, these size of fish. That's why they call them fingerlings. It's about the size of your finger. And we can then move those to their new lake home where they hopefully will grow in an adult size. It's a much more intensive process to go out and net and transport these fish around. And so it gets pretty expensive. And we also just have limits on just the number of places that we can rear these walleye, and it's challenging sometimes to be able to be successful in that, because if other fishes like bullheads or other things get in and compete and eat these walleye, they don't do as well in those natural ponds. We'll certainly do that where we can, but it's a limited tool too. We can't just stock walleye fingerlings everywhere because it's not an unlimited supply of them available. So that's kind of how we manage walleye. And obviously, why do we stock is often a question people ask. A lot of our walleye we catch in Minnesota actually are from naturally reproduced populations where the fish take care of this on their own. Some of our largest walleye lakes, thinking of Mille Lacs or Winnipegashish or some of those Red Lakes, some of those really well-known walleye lakes, they are really great at cranking out walleye every year, and we don't have to do any stocking to supplement that. And so we don't want to do that where we don't have to, because that's a waste of our licensed dollars that we're bringing in from anglers. But then again, we've got a lot of places that people want to catch a walleye and they don't live real close maybe to one of those big walleye lakes. They don't have the equipment or the funding to be able to go up and fish those really productive walleye lakes, so that we create opportunities closer to home. So we've got a lot of lakes around the state that we do manage walleye, knowing that this is our state fish and this is our most popular fish that an angler want to catch. So that's why we do all the stocking we do around the state. The other thing that we do is regulations. So this photograph is a historic one from the early 20th century, back when we didn't have fishing regulations, if you can believe it, about the number of walleye that people are allowed to harvest. There was basically an unlimited opportunity to harvest as many walleye as you wanted. It was sort of reflecting that sort of opinion at the time that our natural resources were so abundant that we couldn't harvest enough fish to actually impact the populations. But unfortunately, as more and more people harvested stringers like this one from Mille Lacs back in the day, we actually started to realize that people could be efficient enough to remove enough fish from a lake to really impact these populations and affect the quality of the fishing. And so our first fishing regulations in the 20s, actually it was 1905, the first regulations said that you could only harvest 25 of any species of fish. So again, it's still a pretty abundant opportunity to harvest fish even back then. By the 1950s and 60s, we started to see some declines in some of our fisheries, and so we actually started to put regulations in place to limit harvest and to help spread out that harvest amongst anglers. So in 1956, we put a 6 walleye limits on walleye, and that's been in place ever since. That's our limit today. One big change that did happen in 2007 is we limited that further to say that you could only have one of your 6 walleye be over 20 inches. So that's kind of our general statewide fishing regulations, and I think that we can pop a link into the chat that shows our sort of statewide fishing regulations and how you can find out about those for walleye and other species. But the other thing we have is we have special fishing regulations. So for certain lakes where we have different management needs, we'll sometimes put a special regulation in place where we regulate things like the number of fish that you're allowed to harvest that might be different from the statewide limit. So it might be that it's a smaller limit on that particular lake because we know that there's enough harvest that if we allowed people to take a full limit of 6, we could really affect the fishing quality. And so we'll have a lower limit at certain places. We also sometimes have size limits. And so you can see this angler measuring this fish. So we might say that you can only harvest fish in a certain size range. Again, that's part of our management, knowing that we have maybe an abundance of fish in a certain size, that it's better to harvest those sizes of fish relative to maybe a different size where the fish are not as abundant, or maybe we're trying to protect the spawning population to make sure we help for that self-sustaining natural reproduction while we allow some harvest of some maybe more immature size of fish. So differing rules depending on where you are. And so it's always good before you go out and go fishing to check those fishing regulations for that water body that you're going to go to and make sure that you know whether there's a special regulation for that particular lake or river. So let's move into some of our other management. One of the other important management tools that we use is around habitat. And for habitat for walleye, one of the most important things we can do is to make sure that they can actually move from one place to another to complete their various life processes, and that includes spawning. So for some watersheds, like this one, this is the Pelican River up by Detroit Lakes. This particular watershed, you can see the Pelican River flows through all of these different lakes: Big Detroit, Sally, Melissa, Pelican, Lizzie, and then lakes like Franklin and Crystal and North Lida are connected via creeks into that watershed. So walleye, like I'd mentioned earlier in the talk, like to move out of lakes a lot of times into river areas to be able to find spawning habitat. And so if we have barriers that we put up that prevent walleye from moving around between these different lakes and river habitats, we can affect their ability to complete some of those important life processes like spawning. So one of the things that historically we've done on a lot of our river systems is we built dams that block passage of fish, and we put those dams up for different purposes, whether that was to generate power or to back up water for a water supply, or some other reasons that we did that. A lot of those dams, though, have eventually sort of not served the original purpose. So maybe that was a mill historically back in the day, and that mill is long gone, but the dam is still there and still having those negative impacts. So DNR has really looked to try to address those sorts of issues by doing projects to either remove or modify dams. And so this is a picture from the upstream end of Lake Sally as the Pelican River flows into Lake Sally. And you can see in the picture on the left, if you kind of zoom into your center of that picture, you can see a dam that used to be along that waterway that connected those two water bodies. And the picture on the right shows that modified location where we went and basically created a sort of a rapids so that the water flows through in a way that the fish can actually move up through that rocky sort of habitat and move between the different habitats. And also that rocky habitat is some of that same habitat that walleyes a lot of times will like to use for spawning as well. And so you can see another one of our egg take stations. That spawning platform in that picture on the right is where the Detroit Lakes station takes eggs from walleye that are moving from Big Detroit Lake upstream in the Pelican River. So here in my next slide, I'm going to jump real quickly to a video that kind of shows what happens around that particular location. So this is just a zoom in picture, some video of fish that are in that rapids downstream or just upstream of Lake Sally. And there's a number of different species in that video. I'll let it run again. You can see it. You can see a really long fish in the center that's a muskie. This is a white sucker here. And then down here, there's a bunch of walleye that are moving around in the picture as well. And so it's not just walleye, but all sorts of other species that benefit from these connectivity projects. It allows all these different fishes to move between different habitats and really complete all those important parts of their life cycle. So we've been trying to do these sort of fish passage types of projects wherever we can to really enhance that connectivity sort of an opportunity for those fish. Getting back to walleye and their spawning, I mentioned earlier that they like to use these riverine systems a lot of times for spawning, but they also will use these sort of shallow, rocky sorts of habitats like you see in this picture within a lake, where they'll go into those rocky habitats when they're ready to spawn, and that is kind of wrapping up for a lot of walleye around the state right now. We are just finishing up our last egg take of the year in far northern Minnesota on Cutfoot Sioux Lake. So walleye are just finishing those processes up in the north. They were probably been done with that for probably a week to 10 days in the south part of the state. So just knowing that that's a part of the walleye biology as we think about where we're going to go fishing in the springtime once the walleye opener happens here in a couple days, it's helpful to know that as we think about where we want to go fishing. So I'm just going to kind of plant that seed as we think about it. This also, I think, is an informative picture and some information about it. This is our state record walleye. It was caught back in 1979. It was 17 pounds and 8 ounces, and it was caught up in Lake Saginaga, so way up in Cook County in the Arrowhead region. And it was caught at the mouth of the Seagull River above the rapids. So it's coming up into a river up out of the lake. And that, as we talked about earlier, now we know exactly why that fish was probably there at that time. It was probably getting ready to spawn. And if you look at the picture of that fish, it's got this big sagging belly. It's probably hasn't spawned yet. And so that's why it was so heavy, is that it had a lot of eggs, probably literally, hundreds of thousands of eggs in it, and several pounds of weight just was eggs for that fish. So some years we have really late springs where the walleye are just finishing up or haven't even spawned yet at this time of the year. I think that this spring, although it's been pretty cool of late, we did, if you remember back, have some fairly warm days back a few weeks ago, even up into the 70s and 80s in certain parts of the state, that really warmed that water up and got that spawning process happening. So this is going to be a year where the fish are going to be moving out of that spawning sort of a habitat where they did that spawning stuff into their sort of post-spawn areas. And so we'll kind of get into a little bit in a few minutes about what exactly that looks like. But before we do that, I want to talk about, kind of just how you would choose where you want to go fishing. So I mentioned, that there's some of these really well-known lakes in northern Minnesota, like Mille Lacs or Red Lake or something, that are really well-known. But you can search for lakes where you want to go fishing much closer to home. So there's a tool on the DNR website called Lake Finder, and you can literally find it right on the front page of the DNR website. On the left, there's the most popular sorts of pages. And this is one of our most popular pages because anglers can go in and type the name of a lake, and it will pop up all of our survey data that we've got. So what our survey netting has showed, and for the fish populations that are out there, But you can also find lake depth maps so that you can kind of seek out the habitats where you want to go fishing. It also has some of the stocking history, so you can know what we've been putting in there. And so you can see just what the opportunities are for walleye fishing on different lakes or whatever other species you want to target. So it's a great resource, a great sort of scouting tool you can do without even having to leave the comfort of your home. So this is a great starting point, I think, for picking out that first place where you want to go fishing for the year. The other resource we've got on our DNR website is that every year, regional managers like myself, there's 4 of us around the state, compile a fishing outlook for our different parts of the state, where we talk to those area offices that we supervise, and they give us basically what they think are some of the hot spots to check out for the year. So a link just got put in the chat about that, where you can find those fishing outlooks. And so it'll give you a list of, for each of the different regions, probably a dozen or more potential locations to check out as lakes to go fishing around the opener or later on in the season. So that's another good resource to check out. All right, let's get into a little bit about walleye habitat use and biology and how that influences where you might want to choose your fishing locations for the year. So there's a lot of different things to think about when it comes to the preferences of walleye and where they're going to be found. Some of that is around structure. So walleye tend to be a fish that isn't just roaming around at random places in the lake. They are using structures because it enhances their ability to eat, or also maybe also enhances their safety. They feel more comfortable in those locations, or it's about some other habitat things that are important to them. So when I think about structure, I've got this long list of different things that kind of entail different types of structure. When I say structure, it's like physical things that are often on the bottom of the lake that influence where walleye are going to be. Walleye are a bottom dwelling fish. They tend to be oriented to, most of the time within, a few feet of the bottom. You'll certainly find certain times of year where walleye are suspended, where they're actually feeding on fish that are living, up way off the bottom, up high. But early in the season is not that time. They're going to be oriented to the bottom, and that's where you're going to tend to want to target them. So when I list these different habitats, some of these are fairly self-explanatory. Points are like where you got something jutting out in the lake. But some of these other things are a little more subtle, and I'll show a map in a second of a lake with a depth map that'll show what some of these things are. But the other things that maybe aren't going to show up on a map are things like weed edges, where you've got vegetation that's growing on the bottom of the lake, and that eventually tapers off to where there's not vegetation anymore. And so that'll often be a fairly defined depth that happens. And a lot of times walleye will be found at the edges of that weedy habitat, because a lot of times the fish that they eat are hanging out in those plants. And so the walleye will be cruising around the edges where they can more efficiently feed rather than right in the plants, because it's really hard for them to navigate and find things. But on the edge, they can move around and pick stuff off as it pops out from those weedy habitats. Walleye will often use bottom transitions, and what I describe as that's actually where you have one type of bottom substrate, like you might have mud, or you might have sand, or you might have gravel, and you'll sometimes have a transition where that bottom substrate changes, and the fish will actually orient to that sort of transition, because there's sometimes other fishes or other prey that's utilizing that transition as well. And then some of these other things, humps and flats, are also sort of structural in nature, and I'll show you those in a second when I get to that depth map. The other things to think about, though, around the fishing opener are temperature. This is a really important part of thinking about where you want to fish on a given lake. So walleye tend to be a cool water species, so they like cooler water temperatures. So in the dead of summer, you're not going to find them in shallow habitats because it's just literally too warm for them. They don't like that really warm water temperature. But at this time of the year, water temperatures are quite cool. And so they actually may seek out some of the warmer water in a given water body, because that is where not only their metabolism is most comfortable, but also that's a lot of times where the prey is going to go. Those smaller fishes and other things that are lower on the food chain, they are really kind of keying into that warmer water temperature, because that's where a lot of the lake productivity kind of gets generated and sort of drums up a lot of the food chain sort of things that walleye are kind of eating on the top of. So wherever the prey is going to go, that's a lot of times where the walleye are going to be as well. So at this time of the year, water temperatures tend to be warmer in the shallower parts of our lakes or in bays or other sort of protected areas that can warm up faster. So think about that as you think about where you're going to go target walleye, is to find that place where the water temps are going to be a little bit higher. So that might even mean just the side of the lake that you fish on. So a lot of times the downwind side of the lake, that's where that warm water gets blown across the surface, and it ends up ponding up sort of at that side of the lake, and the waters are going to be warmer at that side, and that's where a lot of the food is going to be. That's where you're going to find the walleyes as well. And then flow, we talked about how walleye tend to orient to those sort of creek mouths and river mouths, because that's where they maybe were running up to do some spawning, and they often will hang around where those flows come back into the lake, not only because that's geographically like close to where they were when they were spawning, but also that's where sometimes that warmer water is coming in off the landscape, provides a little bit more of a warmer habitat around where that flow comes in, and there might be a lot more biological activity happening around that inflow. And so that's another thing to think about, is where some of those creek mouths and river mouths are flowing into a lake. So let's look at the depth map next and think about, if you were going to go out and target habitats on a lake, where would you go to target walleye? So this is a picture of a chunk of Mille Lacs. You know, it's a classic walleye lake in that it has lots of structure, lots of different bottom sorts of types. And it can feel a little overwhelming when there's that many options for where exactly to go when you target walleye on the fishing opener. My advice is, you know, along the lines of what I talked about earlier, we want to think about temperature probably is an important thing, but also just where were these walleye doing their spawning? Because they oftentimes are not going to swim all the way across the lake after they finish spawning. They're sometimes going to hang around where they just wrapped up spawning, and if there's some food available, they'll just be there feeding. So in Mille Lacs, most of the spawning happens in that sort of shallow, rocky sort of areas along the shoreline. And on this particular map, all of this shoreline along here is exactly that way. It's this gravelly, rocky sort of a shoreline that walleye will use for spawning. And so a lot of times the walleye will still be in this general area. They won't be up in the shallows necessarily in 3 feet of water like they were when they were spawning, but they might be on this first break, this first drop off, where it goes from less than 10 feet down to some greater depth. So you can look at the lake map that you can pull up from Lake Finder on whatever lake you're gonna fish, and look for those sorts of habitats where you might have this sort of a flat that's shallow, and especially windswept sides of lakes. That's where a lot of times the walleye are going to spawn, and then they're going to move to these drop-offs after that in that sort of post-spawn time. So you can target some of these drop-offs, and you can see there's different types of habitat even within this drop-off. Like we've got a really steep drop-off along here that drops at quite deep water quite quickly. Other places like up here, it's a much more gradual drop-off. And you also have some subtle differences along the drop-off, and this is sometimes referred to as sort of the spot on the spot sort of habitats, where we got a little point that's along the drop-off here. We also have what's called an inside turn, where you've got this little sort of mini little bay sort of a habitat, where walleye will sometimes use this as a way to concentrate food up against that drop-off and be able to more efficiently forage against it. So looking for these sort of micro habitats within the drop-off can sometimes be useful as you target the fish. You can also see, though, within this photo of the depth maps, that we've got some of these reefs. So you can see these humps that come up off the bottom that are at shallow depth relative to what's deep around them. And this is not far from this drop-off and this spawning habitat. It might be that this might be one of the fish's first habitats they move to post-spawn, is some of these drop-offs along the edges of these reefs or these humps. So this is another one, this Garrison Reef down here. You can see it gets up to 14 feet or 8 feet even at the shallowest points of this reef. But then there's drop-offs that go down into deeper water. So looking around on some of these nearer to shore sort of habitats where you have reefs is another good opportunity to look for. Some of these more offshore sorts of structures, like this flat out here, these can be later in the summer good habitats, but early season tends to not be where walleye are. They're going to be more oriented to these shallower places and where the warmer water temperatures are. All right, let's move along and think a little bit about other parts of walleye biology and how that might influence your fishing. So walleye get their name from the special eye that they have, where they actually have an eye that can collect way more light than the typical fish's eye can. And so they can actually see quite well in very dim conditions. And that makes them, a more efficient predator in that sort of a condition. And so when we think about this eye and this special ability to see in those low light conditions, it's actually kind of the opposite in the really bright times of the day. When it has this really sensitive eye to light, they are not as prone to be feeding, especially in shallower water in the middle of the day, in the brighter times of the day. And so you want to think about when you're going to go fishing, because walleye tend to be most active during the lower light times of the day, because that's when they're most efficient. They can see really well, and a lot of their prey can't see as well, and so they can't see them coming. And so that's when walleye tend to be most active, is early in the morning as the sun's just starting to come up, or in the evening as the sun's starting to go down. The other thing is that walleye, one of the other things that cuts down on the amount of light that's penetrating down into the water is actually the wave action on the surface. All of the choppy water will break up some of that light and keep it from going down too deep. And so as a result, you can end up having fish be more active when you've got that, what they call the walleye chop. And that's when you get a little bit of wave action on the surface. And so this is another reason to want to be on that downwind side of the lake, if possible, is that wave action will make it so that there's not as much light penetration, and the walleye will be more actively feeding when you've got that condition in place. All right, let's talk a little bit about forage, what the walleye are looking to eat in the early season. At that time of the year, they are mostly feeding on fish. And so there's not a lot of like insect life or other things that really get the walleye's attention. They are mostly feeding on other fish. And what's interesting is in the spring, they basically have to eat whatever forage was available from the previous year. So it's stuff that had to have hatched and grown to a larger size through the previous year, because nothing is going to hatch that's going to be big enough for them to eat until later in the summer. And so they're this is when the forage tends to be the lowest. Is it really early in the season? Because whatever's there, things have been eating it all year long. And so there's less of it available. And so the walleye tend to be really hungry. And also they just came off of a long winter of not having a lot of things to eat. They just finished spawning. And so after that time, they're putting the feed bag on. They're looking for food to try to get going and have some energy again. And there's not as much available. And so this is a great time of year, is early in the season. May is like probably the best time of the year to fish for walleye. And so around the opener should be a really good time to fish too. And as you think about what to fish with, you probably want to do something that is either fishing with actually a live minnow like these. These are spot-tail shiner, which is a really popular early season bait. Spot-tail shiners tend to spawn around the early May sort of walleye opener, and they are a bait that a lot of anglers will then use to target walleye, because that's literally what the walleye are trying to eat in a lot of these lakes. But other minnows can be good too. So let's talk about minnows as one of those presentations. So a really simple way to fish walleyes is to use a jig. So something that's got a weight that's attached to the hook, and then a minnow that's hooked onto that hook. And there's multiple ways you can hook a minnow. One of them is just through the lips, like you see here. That keeps the fish alive for a little while, and you can then jig through the water, and it swims in a fairly natural sort of a way. But you do have a fair amount of the hook that ends up showing when you do that, and sometimes walleye can spot that and say, that doesn't look quite right, and not be as sure they want to eat it. This trick hook sort of a method, you actually can put the shank of the hook through the fish's mouth and then punch the hook out further back in the fish. This may result in your fish or your minnow not staying alive quite as long, because you might injure it in the process of doing that hooking. but it ends up covering up more of your hook, and it looks a little bit more natural as you jig your minnow along. So you might try both of those approaches and see which one the fishes might be, the walleye are more willing to bite on. But give those both a try and see what's working. The other way to hook a minnow is underneath the dorsal fin. They can live a lot longer when you do it this way, but if you're doing sort of a jigging motion where you're tugging that fish through the water, it doesn't look very natural when you're sort of tugging it from the top and it's popping up and down. So that's typically a way you would hook it if it was more fishing under a bobbin, or I'll get to a little bit of that sort of configuration a little bit. You can also fish with these artificial sorts of lures that look like a fish, but aren't actually a real fish. And so again, you can have a jig like these jig heads are, and then the hook comes through the body of the plastic sort of fish-like sort of a body. And you can see you can have all these different shapes and all these different colors, and you can even have different types of jig heads. This one's got more of a loose sort of a split shot thing that's on the line with a regular hook that comes through rather than a jig. So there's different ways to hook these sorts of plastic type lures, but you're bouncing these along the bottom. So you jig it. That's what it means by jigging, is you're lifting it up and down and slowly retrieving it that way. And that's a sort of a way to attract that fish's attention, and it sees it hopping along and will go up and try to investigate and eat it. It's a great way to target these bottom oriented fish that walleye tend to be at this time of the year. And you can see all these different colors. Some of them are fairly fish-like, these sort of silvery sorts of colors. Others are very bright and gaudy colors that you wouldn't think would at all look like a natural fish, and why would a fish even think about eating something like that? Tends to be that you use these more natural colors, the silvers and the greens and grays and golds, in clearer water where the fish can see quite well and can see these more natural colors really well from a distance. Those more bright colors are ones you want to use when you're fishing a lake or a river that's got more turbid water. And so they need to have a little bit more bright sort of a color to catch a fish's attention from a greater distance. And even though it doesn't look very fish-like, the fish seem to not know that. they'll eat these bright colors as well. So it's often good to try different colors as well as different shapes and sizes of these presentations to see what the fish are interested in. And then another approach, another technique is to use what's called a slip bobber, where you have something you attach to your line that keeps that bobber from sliding along, and then a certain amount of line down to where you've got your actual bait that you're fishing with. And you can set this stopper on the line so that the distance from the stopper to where your bait is such that it keeps your bait maybe a foot or two off the bottom. And so that your bobber is suspending it and then keeping it at that depth close to the bottom so that it's right where the fish are. And but it also keeps it off the bottom, keeps it from getting snagged. And you can just sit and watch that bobber and wait for it to go down and know that there's a fish that's there. This tends to be a presentation that people will use when it's not super wavy, not super windy. You can just cast that out and let it sit, and a little bit of a gentle walleye chop will kind of move it up and down and literally naturally jig your presentation for you. And you can put either a leech like this picture, or you can put a minnow under that slip bobber as well. And then also there's these hard baits that imitate minnows. Some of them are intended to jig vertically, like this one, where you've got the place you attach your line on the top. So you can jig that straight up and down pretty much in an area where you think there might be walleye. There's also other ones that are more of a crankbait style, like these down here, where you can cast and retrieve these across habitats and sort of cover a little bit more water that way, where you think walleye might be. You can also troll these sorts of lures behind the boat and pick up fish and cover a lot of water that way as well. So, in the early season, like I said, the fish have got the feed bag on, and so sometimes one presentation will outperform another, but it's good if something's not working for a while, switch it up and try something different. All right, one other thing as we think about going out for fishing that I want to definitely make mention of is that we don't want to forget our fishing licenses. So we got to make sure that you go and get that taken care of. You can either do it at your local bait shop, at the DNR central office, or you can go online, and we can pop a link in the chat that shows you where you can go purchase your fishing licenses. And then from a safety perspective, one other thing I'll remind people of is that the water temperatures a lot of times are pretty cold at this time of the year. And so you want to make sure that you are wearing your PFD, because if you fall overboard into that cold water, you're not going to be able to swim for very long, even if you're a good swimmer. And so having that flotation device on early in season is always important. So hopefully that gives you some things to think about as you get ready for the fishing opener. But I'm happy to answer questions that people might have as you think about what you want to do for the fishing opener.
Thank you, Brian. That was really great information. So again, just a reminder that if you have any questions for Brian, make sure that you drop that in the Q&A, which you can find down at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Look for the little three dots or the ellipses, so you can go ahead and drop any of that in there. That was really great information, Brian, and I know that's going to set people up to go fishing this weekend. I know that part of fishing is learning about the fish, its biology, and where to find them, along with the rules and regulations. So that's really wonderful that we were able to share some of that. And we hope that this information is going to help everybody out there, especially learning a little bit more about our state fish.
But yeah, I think that as we wait for the questions to come in, people a lot of times are looking for that sort of secret sort of place to go fishing, and also just looking for more resources for how to target walleye. And there's so many great resources out there on the web. We shared some of our DNR website sort of options that are out there for how to learn how to fish and stuff. But there's a YouTube video for everything these days, and there's more than a few for walleye fishing. And so there's all sorts of anglers that have been willing to share their knowledge and their secrets out there as well. And so it's an awesome time to be an angler, where you can learn a lot and become a much better angler without having to put in the years on the water that some of those old timers maybe had to do back in the day too.
Yes, it's also a great opportunity if you are an avid angler this time of the year is to bring out a new angler that's interested. So,
That is a great
um,
suggestion, May, because we definitely want to have that next generation of anglers come along, and it's a great activity, a social activity. It's a great way to get people out of the house and not look at screens and other things. And so, yeah, hopefully people do that.
yes. And if anything, if it's something you're interested in, like sometimes it's just you learn as you go. Like I think everybody is constantly learning all the time. So,
For
we do
sure.
have a question. So the question is, have the locations of your spawning sites for egg take changed over the years, and what has the DNR learned to cause those change? What has the DNR learned to cause those changes?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. So we have, like I said, those 10 hatcheries, and most of those hatcheries are associated with an egg take, but not all of them. But we've got them spread around the state because we want to have our hatcheries typically close to where those egg takes are, because we don't want to have to haul those fish very far and risk having some, loss of the eggs while they're getting transported or anything. So we tend to spread them around so that we've got them spread around the state. And we've had different points in time where we've tried to have, that geographic spread be really wide. And then at other times said, well, this particular run, although it is a little bit more spread out from some of the other ones, we've got another one that does so well that's relatively close by that we don't need to have quite as many runs as we maybe historically did. And so we'll sometimes let one of them go that we don't need to do because we've got such a productive one that's really close by that we can also utilize. And then also some of them we'll actually just find a better place to collect the eggs. So my first job when I started with DNR was in Fergus Falls, and I worked at that area office. Historically, the egg take was on the Otter Tail River, just upstream from Otter Tail Lake. It's a fairly large river, and it was much more challenging to block off that particular river and put up a trap and collect fish there. We had a lot of issues with debris and other things that would come down the river. We moved it later on to the Dead River, which flows into a smaller lake, then into Otter Tail Lake. It flows through Walker Lake. And it's a smaller creek that it's much easier to block off, but still gets a really good run of walleye that come up there, and so we can get all the eggs we need from that particular site. So it varies from place to place about why we might, switch to doing it at a different place, but we're trying to just be as efficient as possible is basically the short of it. And so we've learned over time how to be better about that.
Great. Is there actually a benefit for along those lines? Is there a benefit for kind of like reproducing like the walleye fingerlings like in a natural habitat versus like at say like a hatchery?
So obviously the natural reproduction that happens in a lot of our walleye lakes, it can produce way more walleye than we're going to be able to stock into a lake, and so it's always better to have that natural reproduction when we can. Um, so yeah, we do whatever we can, and that's why we're doing the habitat work that we're doing with connectivity to try to increase that natural reproduction of walleye as much as we can. Um, and one other thing I should mention about those walleye egg takes is that many of them actually allow the public to go visit them. So it's a pretty fun thing for people to check out in the springtime. If you've never seen that before, you can see all of those walleye that are being caught at the trap and see the process, by which we take the eggs and such. And some of our hatcheries actually allows some public visitation as well. And so, places like Waterville and southern Minnesota allow public to come and visit and see some of the processes happening in the hatcheries. So if people are interested, you can check out some of your local area fisheries offices and see if there's a walleye egg take nearby that you want to maybe go visit to.
Okay. Would you recommend them just reaching out to figure out where it is?
Yeah, so we don't have anything on our website that shows the locations for all of these places because some of them are not necessarily totally set up like in a park or something like that. So it's not always, not all of the egg take sites are publicly accessible, and sometimes it's a little more challenging. So talking to staff before you show up, just so you kind of know the where and the when and the how, is a really good idea.
Great. There's another question. So this viewer says, I know that during the opener, there's a lot of people that are in certain areas, and this person says, I don't want to deal with the madness of a boat landing this weekend. Would it make sense to instead fish off the dock? And I'm assuming they're maybe asking specifically, like if, fishing off the dock for walleye.
I know a lot of people who their fishing opener tradition is literally at 12:01 midnight. They're on their dock casting a bobber out and fishing from the dock in the evening, because during that low light time of the day, the walleye can come up shallower. Depends on how deep it is off your dock and whether you've got at least reasonable depths that you can cast to. If you can get to 6-8 feet of water, or a little bit deeper, then probably there's a chance that walleye might come through where you could fish from the dock, especially in that sort of evening or early morning time of the year. The other thing that I should mention is that if you want to get away from the crowds, sometimes going to a river instead of a lake is a way to do that. And so a lot of people here in the land of 10,000 lakes think that, oh yeah, we've got to go walleye fishing on our lakes. But some of our rivers have fantastic walleye fishing. The Minnesota River, the Mississippi River, the Governor's Fishing Opener is on the St. Croix River this year. So that's where I'm going to be on opening day, is fishing the St. Croix River. And there's phenomenal walleye fishing in some of those river systems. So yeah, you can check out some of those sorts of options, and literally fishing from shore on a river is very doable, and especially if you can get to a little bit of a depth where you're fishing to, you got a real good chance to catch walleye there too.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great reminder. This person asks, what determines where you stock hatchery raised walleyes and what determines how many fingerlings you put into a lake when you stock it?
Very good questions. So one of them is social a little bit, where, like I said, we're trying to create walleye opportunities where maybe there wouldn't be as many of them. So I think of here in my region, I've got the Twin Cities metropolitan area as part of my region. And if we had just left walleye to where they would be naturally, we would not have many opportunities here in the Twin Cities metro. But knowing that there's a lot of people and a lot of anglers that would like to catch walleye close to home, we manage a bunch of lakes here in the Twin Cities metro for walleye, and so we're stocking those lakes. That being said, we don't stock them in every lake here in the Twin Cities metro either. We're stocking them in lakes where we feel like they have a better chance to succeed, and some of that comes down to, what are the habitats that are present in the lake? So does it have some of those deeper, cooler waters that walleye tend to prefer? And then also what other things are there that might be competitors with them. And so if it's a lake that has a lot of northern pike and largemouth bass, things that are other predators that might either be eating the same things walleye eat or literally want to eat baby walleye when we stock them in there, if we have a really high abundance of those other predators, that's generally not a great place for us to manage trying to stock walleye as well. And so we're trying to look at the whole fish community, and then also just what is the available forage? Is there the right species and sizes of fish that walleye would want to eat as well, that we could put another predator in and have them have a good chance to succeed too. So that all comes into it. And some of it is, once we decide we're going to manage a lake for a walleye, we'll try to experiment with some of those different size stages. So the fry, like I said, tend to be our sort of cheaper and more efficient way to stock walleye. And so we'll look at sometimes just what is the biology of what's out there and whether things are going to necessarily be eating those baby fry when we put them out there. And if there's a lot of other predators, maybe we'll try that larger size, the fingerlings, to see if that's what's needed to get them to succeed.
Right. Uh, this next viewer is asking, where can I find a public boat launching lot on a lake and how much parking is there?
That's another thing you can find on that Lake Finder webpage, is that it will tell you where the public landings are, and it will even tell you how many spaces they have at them. So you can at least make a plan for that. One other thing that, while I'm talking about boat launches, that I might suggest too, is that people, for one thing, you can look at the number of spaces, and if it's a spot that only has 4 parking spaces or something, know that there's a chance that it might be full when you go there that day. So have a backup plan for where you're going to go launch if you literally show up on Saturday morning and there's not a parking space. The other thing is that some lakes accesses, when the water level is low, like in certain parts of the state, are kind of the case right now because we've had a relatively dry period where we've had some drought and water levels are lower on a lot of our lakes. Sometimes it's very hard to launch a larger boat on some of these public water accesses. So if that's at all a question for you, a concern, you might actually want to go check out that boat landing this week to make sure that the water levels are okay to where you can launch. Or if you don't want to just do that, at least have a backup plan in case when you get there, that is the case, and you know where you might be able to go as an alternative.
That's a great idea. So just kind of scope it out before you get there. But also having a backup plan is a great idea as well. And, like lucky for us here in Minnesota, like you mentioned, we have many opportunities and many access to fishing. So we really hope that everybody can find a way to engage in those opportunities. And let me check the Q&A really quick to see if there are any more questions. Again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and I believe that was the last one here. All right. So again, thank you, Brian, for joining us today. And you shared some really great information to get people started, and especially if they want to catch their first walleye or just a walleye for the first walleye for the season. Again, this weekend is the opener, so we hope that this information helps either clarify or any questions that or answer any questions that you may have, and hope that you can get out. A reminder that this episode was recorded, so if you wanted to revisit any of that information that Brian shared with us today, you will be able to receive a link, or you can also find it on our website as well in our archive. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and make sure that you register for next week's episode. So one of our our biologists from our fisheries department will be here to share a little bit about a relatively new bass species that's expanding in southern Minnesota. And this weekend is going to be a really beautiful weekend for the opener. So we really hope that you are going to be able to get out on the water and do some fishing. And we hope that we see you next week. So thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for being with us today.
Thanks for joining us. Good luck out there.